Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.
Looking at the Fitch recent rating, what does it say about Georgia to investors and to creditors?
Well, in our most recent credit review of Georgia, we affirmed the rating at BB, but we revised the outlook from positive to stable. So this in itself was based on a few factors. So firstly, it was what we saw as heightened political risk, which flowed from the passage of the so-called Foreign Agents Law or the Foreign Transparency Law in May, June of this year. We saw how that proved to be highly politically divisive. And given the context of the upcoming parliamentary elections, we feel that this has already raised quite sharply political polarization in society and potentially the risk of social unrest as well.
Sorry, I will be following up on each of your. Why does that matter in the framework of what is Fitch looking at and what is Fitch specifically assessing for Georgia?
It is quite important because it has an impact on both the quality of governance or governance indicators as measured by the World Bank, which directly feed into our assessment of credit ratings. And also, given that the passage of this law has attracted quite a bit of negative scrutiny from key Western partners, and in particular the European Union. And as you know, as recently as this week, the European Union ambassador to Georgia has said that the EU accession process is being put on hold, which is just a few months after Georgia achieved negotiated country status. So these reduce further upside for the credit rating of Georgia, at least in the near term.
Fitch also says that political uncertainty could maintain pressure on the lari and reserves through the election cycle.
Well, you saw that in the immediate aftermath of this law's passage in the middle of May. So the lari started depreciating to the extent that the National Bank of Georgia felt the need to intervene, and it has done that on a few occasions since then. So this is a sentiment issue, in our opinion. But why it really matters for Georgia from a credit perspective is that Georgia has a lot of foreign currency denominated debt. So a fall in the value of the lari would be, all other factors equal, negative for Georgia's credit metrics. And it could also result in an increase in dollarization levels. So which is why the trajectory of the lari is quite important from a credit ratings perspective for Georgia.
These dollarization levels and also the debt levels, which Fitch in its rating says that it's quite okay for Georgia at this point of view, are such types of factors that could change the rating and risks to the rating sharply in a short period of time. Is that right?
Well, firstly, on the government debt levels of Georgia, so Georgia currently still does better compared to most of its rating peers on government debt levels. The issue is the composition of the debt, in which there is a heavy composition of foreign currency denominated debt, right? So if there is severe pressure on the lari, then we have a market risk to debt dynamics over there. On dollarization within the banking sector, we feel that for this rating level, that is at BB, it is not necessarily unusual. But that said, it does represent a vulnerability. And going forward, it would be part of the considerations that we have when we look at potentially whether there is upside to the rating.
One of the focuses in this rating is on the precautionary IMF standby arrangement, where the Fitch said that it remains off the track and it is unlikely to resume before the October elections. And this program is directly linked with some of the reforms, some of the institutional reforms, and also also to the questions that are arising about the central bank's independence and institutional soundness. So how does this relate to the Fitch ratings framework, and why should investors and creditors bother about these specific reforms?
Well, we care about this, and so would most investors, because it is indicative of policy credibility. Because IMF programs often act as, within quotes, stamps of approval of policy credibility for countries. And IMF programs or IMF standby agreements, like the one that Georgia had until it was suspended, also often produce a lot of technical assistance, which is seen as positive for a country's macroeconomic policy management. So even if Georgia was not particularly in need from a fiscal perspective or from an external reserves perspective of drawing down these funds which were available under the SBA, the concerns that the IMF has, which you have named, like central bank independence, for example, reforms of SOEs and so on, are issues that need to be resolved, which have not been done. And as as you said, we do believe that, given political sensitivities and also the fact that Parliament does not really have the bandwidth to deal with this before the election, it is extremely unlikely, in our view, that the IMF program is going to be restored until the other side of the elections.
There is a quite big chunk on the uncertainty for commercial banks in Georgia. Why is this focus on commercial banks, and how do they relate to the economic soundness of the country?
Yeah, I would not like to comment too deeply on the banks themselves, but I would mention that, remember, like, two of the largest banks are listed in the UK. So one of the things that we raised in our latest report is that that there has been an increased uncertain environment for banks, particularly when it comes to application of sanctions, Russia-relevant sanctions against citizens of Georgia. This could complicate things for banks, particularly those that are listed in the UK, because obviously they will have to comply with Western sanctions. So it is issues like these, which the IMF has also noted, which raise questions about the consistency and credibility of macroeconomic policy and supervisory policy of key institutions, which also contributed to our decision to revise the outlook from positive to stable.
One thing is international sanction implementation, and also this loyalty to this international sanction regime, where Georgia is doing quite well according to all assessments. But another thing is, and this is in light of the so-called Russian law that we have already discussed, that some of the high officials of the Georgian Dream and Georgian government might be sanctioned by the US and the EU because of this passage of the law that we have already discussed. Why haven't you considered these individual sanctions, or sanctions applying to the country for that matter? I mean, wouldn't that also be important for investors? Wouldn't that hamper, for example, FDI inflows? These are some of the assessments that we hear from both from local and international analysts regarding Georgia.
Yeah. Well, firstly, with regard to the sanctions from the US on an unknown number of individuals that happened recently last month that you are talking about, we have of course taken that into cognizance. At this moment, we are not aware of any softening in stance on the side of the Georgian government in terms of withdrawing this legislation or postponing its implementation. If it were to be done, if we saw signs that the Georgian government was entering into a constructive conversation with some of its key Western partners, then we would observe quite closely as to see what that means for political risk, and indeed for broader social stability risk, particularly given that you have quite an important election coming up in a few months' time. With regard to implementation of sanctions on Russia that you mentioned, yes, I mean, we have seen that Georgia, particularly within the banking sector, seems to be implementing it quite strongly. We understand that Georgia has a relatively strong cooperation with most Western countries. So we do not expect Georgia to be, at least from that perspective, at particularly high risks of secondary sanctions.
One more law that probably we thought that would be considered in this rating was law on offshores, because this is also seen as the tool that might increase doubts over the international sanction evasion regime and also put pressure on commercial banks in Georgia. But you haven't considered. You make an emphasis on the so-called Russian law, but you haven't mentioned the law on offshores. What is the reason for that?
I believe you're referring to the offshore assets being transferred to Georgia law.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we have considered it. I mean, in the broader scheme of things, from if you look at what drove our rating decision, this would probably not be on that list of what drove our rating decision. So the ones that drove are what I mentioned earlier, right, with the increased political risks to policy credibility, particularly independence of the central bank, as well as weaker external finances, which we have not really discussed. But to answer your question, yes, I mean, this is something that we are noticing. And again, there are a few different ways of interpreting this. Firstly, bringing back assets into the country would, other things being equal, improve the external asset position, so the sovereign external balance sheet. So that is not something that can easily be discounted. Of course, there are concerns that have been raised, including by the IMF, on whether the tax holidays that have been given or tax exemptions for those who repatriate their assets from tax havens and so on are perhaps too generous. That could be a governance issue, and also it could lead to concerns over, say, for instance, corruption and like retroactively forgiving people for corruptly taking the assets overseas and things like that, which we would not necessarily want to comment on. At the moment, we don't consider it a rating driver, but it is something that we are keeping a close eye on.
Okay, thank you for that clarity. Also, I want to ask you about this large project, which is a nuclear port project, and you probably know, Mr. Arvind, that the government is currently considering Chinese investments. That won't be that diversified. I mean, 49% stake will be governed by the Chinese state company and some companies that are associated with it. We've read and we've heard and we've researched a lot about the Chinese debt trap, which many countries have experienced. Is it something that in future Fitch ratings might be looking closely at whether that materializes in some kind of risks to the overall credit stability of the country?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's certainly something that we are observing quite closely. But there are at least two things that I would like to say over here. One is the quality of the tendering process, because remember that Anaklia, that the government has already tried to tender this before, and it did not end quite well. So, this is like round two, if you like, right? So, we understand that there are concerns from many parties over the transparency of the tendering process. There are concerns that the company which is involved may have some sanctions exposure. So how does Georgia manage these kinds of risks? That is certainly something that would have an impact on governance. Secondly, again, while we are not privy to the commercial terms of this agreement, if, say, for instance, like it were, say, a PPP project or something like it, and it added to significant contingent liabilities, again, dependent on how the transaction is structured, and as I said, we do not have access to this, then we would have to assess quite closely to see whether they could add contingent liabilities to the sovereign, which, other things being equal, may be negative.
Thank you so much for that answer as well. Also, like looking again at the overall rating, could we say that at this point, this BB rating affirmation is about the sound macroeconomic, the figures that Georgia has, and how sustainable is that in the long run, considering that migration effect may dissolve and all the external factors that have been helping Georgia so far to have double-digit economic growth and to maintain from all assessments quite high economic growth to this point.
Yeah, we think that the BB rating is appropriate for Georgia, and we think that it is actually quite sustainable for Georgia. Remember that Georgia has been at this rating level for quite a few years now. Of course, you know that since 2022, particularly Georgia's economic growth levels have been very strong. And that has actually provided a sustainable boost to the economy. It has led to, in general, a big strengthening of the currency, and it has improved a lot of credit metrics for the country. Now, we don't expect currently, at least, that there will be a big reversal of these trends. For instance, that like a lot of the capital that has come in over the last couple of years into Georgia is going to find its way out of the country. And growth prospects still remain relatively strong. So we expect growth of about 5.5% on average over the next 3 years, this year included, which is actually quite strong for this rating level as well. And also, remember, even though from an external finances perspective, Georgia underperforms its rating peers, from a fiscal finances perspective, actually, Georgia has good discipline, a good track record, and also it has relatively low debt levels. So these are strengths for the credit rating. And also governance standards, which have historically been above rating peers, though it remains to be seen how the latest developments, particularly with the passage of the law and the other factors that we discussed, could impact on governance standards in the short to medium term.
And my last question, thank you so much for your time. You mentioned that Georgia has been in the junk rating for quite a few years now. What could make a breakthrough? I mean, what are the best practices for the upgrade in rating?
The biggest vulnerabilities for Georgia from a credit perspective is its external position. So Georgia, actually, it runs consistently and structurally large current account deficits. So as a result of that, it has a large external debt position. And we penalize Georgia for that in the way that we carry out our rating assessment by subtracting, as we call it, a notch from the model produced rating for Georgia. So if Georgia were able to improve its external position in a sustainable manner, then that would provide positive upside to the rating. Secondly, if there were reforms that strengthen the policy framework in a sustainable manner, which could lead to potential increase, potentially stable and robust improvement in, say, institutional independence and potential growth prospects, that would also be positive for the rating. And thirdly, even though, as I mentioned, that Georgia's public debt levels are actually better than rating peers, if there were like sustained fiscal policies that led to a credible and sustained reduction in public debt levels, then that would also be positive for the rating.
The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.